And so I'll do my little soapbox about squares at a contra dance because I absolutely love squares. And a lot of callers who do squares, who love squares, sometimes I think they make bad choices about where they place the squares in their program. And it is my firm belief that unless you have a room of people that are 100% into squares, you don't do a square after 10 o'clock. You just don't. Because, say I do a square at 10:15 or 10:30. Dancers look at their watch. They don't like squares, right? So they look at their watch. Yeah, it's 10:30. Just gonna do this square. There's gonna be one contra dance after this. I'm just gonna go home. So, you've called your square, but you've sacrificed the rest of the dance, the energy of the dance, because people have said, I'm just, you know, I gotta work tomorrow. One more dance, I'm just gonna go home. It's a half an hour away, you know? So it's about timing of where you put those dances in your program. In the beginning of the half, I'll usually, if I'm gonna do a square, do it around the 4th dance, so that there's a couple contra dances after it. And then I'll do, if I do one in the second half, it's gotta be before 10 o'clock. Like I said, unless everybody's totally into it. But that's my personal philosophy. And I love squares, and I want people to love them, but I'm not going to shove them down their throats. And I'm not going to sacrifice the dance, the rest of the dance, the whole program, so that I can get a square in there.
Well, you call amazing squares.
I think it's nice to have variety during a contra dance. We don't have a lot of variety in contra dances anymore.
No.
20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I first started dancing, there was variety. It was no big deal to call a square. People loved it. Call a mixer, people loved it. You know, it didn't matter. People just wanted to dance. But the focus has changed.
Yeah, it has.
It's changed a lot. And you can either work within the change where it is and make little incremental changes if you like something different. But if you try to just wholesale change it when the energy focus of everybody is different, you're not going to make any friends for your cause or yourself. So, you know, you have to sort of work within the system somehow. And so when I call squares, my goal is to call really, for contra dances, I call squares that are rip-roaring, crazy, fun, all moving, successful party dances.
I came into Contra only like 6, 7 years ago.
Okay.
So I don't have that history. Mm-hmm. And for me, the squares are boring. And but I've spent a lot of time.
They can be.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and it seems to me but squares can be fun in a square dance. And here's why I don't like to mix them. It seems to me that there's two different dynamics going on. That in a square dance, you're dancing to the caller. And so the caller is telling you where to go, and it's the figures and stuff that are interesting. So the caller is taking you on a trip, on a journey through something, which is fun. And the band can be perfectly well suited to be an old-time band, which simply just put your foot down, put your foot down, and it doesn't need any phrasing because you're dancing to the caller.
Right.
Whereas
you're dancing to the phrasing too,
but
it's not the same. It's not the same marriage of music and dance.
Exactly.
As a contra dance.
But if you're dancing to a contra dance, the caller gets you started with, and as you said, the goal to get the dancers to learn the dance. And now you're dancing to the music. Right. And it's you know, you talk to Laura Lennox about how important the phrasing is, how she tells you the figures with her music.
Oh yeah.
And to me, I think, you know, people ask what's so good about the dance, and for me, what I love about the dance is the music. And to the contra dance, I'm dancing to the music, and I just love that. Yeah. And now somebody calls a square, and they say, and now we want you to do some tricky figures that you know, you're going to go under the arm and through the thing and hoop the hoop, and it's like, that's fun, but I want to dance to the music.
It's a different energy, and I find that I call squares less at contra dances. Yeah. And there is this wonderful resurgence of dances that are just square dances all over the country. Right. I mean, in Washington, D.C., they square dance in this church. There are going to be 300 kids in there square dancing in a church. It's crazy. The sound is garbage. I mean, it's just reverberant all over the place, and you have to demonstrate every figure so that people have a picture to work with when they can't understand what you're telling them to do. But there's this resurgence all over. Started on the West Coast. It's everywhere now. And it's exciting. So I call contra dances, I call less square dances than I did 15 years ago.
Well, they have, I went to the Jack of Hearts, is that what it was?
Yeah.
And it was a blast. You know, the musicians were drunk, the caller was drunk, the dancers were drunk.
Yeah.
But they were having, that was Ben.
Right.
Ben, what's his name?
Sure, Ben Nelson.
Ben Nelson,
Yeah.
I mean, he just did a wonderful job of just making very exciting dances.
Oh, yeah.
So it was a different
And we
energy.
had fun at the toy boat dance we did together recently, a couple of weeks ago. It was a great crowd. It was really fun. And as a person who loves squares and calls squares, it's a pleasure to be on stage to call for a room full of dancers who are totally into squares.
Yes.
Instead of, like, I remember years ago I went to call a dance and I was going to call a couple of squares because that's what I did. Not a lot. I mean, I've never been one to call a ton of squares during a contra dance, just because I know. I've talked to dancers. I understand what dancers like. And I got up there on stage and I said, the next dance is going to be a square. And the whole room went, aw, man, talk about pressure.
Yeah.
You know? And I've just learned, for me to call a square at a contra dance, it takes the right energy from the floor, the right energy from the band. You know, it has to be music that's going to give me a really good ride so that I can give the dancers a good ride. And I'm only going to call square dances that I can teach very quickly, that I can get dancers moving so that it feels good. For contra dancers, I have a whole list of squares I call for contra dancers. I want them to keep their partner, because contra dancers want to keep their partner when they square dance, because that's what you do when you contra dance. I want it to be all moving, I love visiting couple dances, the traditional, where couple number 1 goes out and does something with number 2, and then number 3, and then number 4. Those are fine. Not for a contra dance, because it's too much standing around, and our contra dancers of today don't want to stand around. They want to be moving.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right? So if I call one of those, I'm not making any friends for me or for square dancing. But if I call a more contra dance like square, that's just in a square formation and they're doing moves of contra dancing, but in this, the possibilities open up because of the structure, and you can do really cool things that way, then it's interesting.
It is very interesting. And I remember sitting out a square once when you were calling, and I was actually really glad I did, because the calling was, I mean, you were like a rap star. It was just, it was like, wow. It was fun to listen to. I'm not sure what it would have been like to dance to.
I think it was probably fun to dance to, too. I'd like to think so, anyway.
Yeah.
I'm going to do squares at a contra dance. There'll be one in the first half, maybe one in the second half. And often not at all.
Right.
It just depends. It has to feel right.
No, that's really, well, when Phil calls, he does a lot of squares, but it's interesting when he does them, because they build. So it is a little bit more fun. But there was another interesting difference I found when he was calling. So he was calling the squares, and everybody's dancing to his calling. Everybody's saying swing your partner, and they swing, and so everybody's doing what they said. And then he started calling a contra, and the band was a better band, I think, for squares, more old-timey without the phrasing. And so now he's saying long lines forward and back, and everybody's going, and I'm like, well, wait, the music hasn't come around yet. And now everybody's dancing to the calling, and they're not dancing to the phrasing of the music. It was really...
Yeah, it's interesting mixing the two together.
Yeah.
And not everybody can pull both of them off at the same time.
Yeah, that's...
Not every band can, not every caller can.
Yeah, I think you need a band that can both give the energy of the contra and drive the dance, and then just provide the beat for the square.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, it is fun to call squares just swing tunes. I've had bands pull out swing tunes for squares. In fact, that growly